you all for being here on this very special evening. Tonight, Whittier has been honored with a very important guest. Author of Tattoos on the Heart, Father Gregory Boyle is here to share his story about community and how his life work has had an impact in Los Angeles County.
Father Gregory Boyle established Homeboy Industries as a place where people can change the direction of their life. Homeboy Industries provides hope, training, and support to formerly gang-involved and previously incarcerated men and women, allowing them to redirect their lives and become contributing members of our community.
Each year, over 10,000 former gang members from across Los Angeles pass through Homeboy Industries' doors in an effort to make a positive change. They are welcomed into a community of mutual kinship, love, and a wide variety of services, ranging from tattoo removal to anger management and parenting classes.
Full-time involvement is offered for more than 200 men and women at a time through an 18-month program that helps re-identify who they are in the world, offers job training so they can move on from Homeboy Industries and become contributing members of the community. Now it is with great pleasure that we introduce Father Gregory Boyle as the 2015 new Student Convocation speaker, returning him once again to his poet family.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be with all of you. I think I've spoken, I spoke at a graduation once, I think. And it was a hot-ass day. That's the only thing I remember. And we were covered in whatever we were covered in, but nobody else was. I felt terrible. It's a real privilege to be with you this evening. Sorry that many of you were forced against your will to read my book. But it's the privilege of my life for 30 years to have worked with gang members and thousands and thousands of them. They've transformed my life. They've saved me. They've rescued me. And I've learned everything of value. The day won't ever come when I am more noble, or I have more courage, or I'm closer to God than the men and women I've been privileged to know. People like Luis Perez, who kind of helps run the place now, but he was a gang member, tattooed, been to prison, shot caller, heroin addict. He did all that stuff, and now he kind of runs the place. But he's also become something of a public speaker in his own right. We went out to dinner not that long ago, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, no shit, yeah. So brace yourselves. There's a kind of a vision that brings you out here on this gorgeous night, and it's not me. It has nothing to do with me. It has only to do with you. The fact that there is something inside of each one of us, each one of you, that wants the world to look differently than it currently looks. And good for you. But there's a vision that undergirds it all. Part of your educational course is to find that vision. The prophet Habakkuk writes, "The vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it." But none of us really want to wait for too long, con los brazos cruzados, tapping your feet, staring at your watches. All of us want to make something happen. We want to roll up our sleeves. We want to see something get accomplished. And good for you. And I think the thing that we hope to accomplish always is the creation and the formation of a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Mother Teresa, I think, diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we together choose to dismantle the barriers that exclude? How do we find ourselves out at the margins? with the Pope Francis here in the United States. That was a constant theme. The edges, the margins, the peripheries he'll use sometimes, which is an odd word. But you stand at the margins because the truth is, if you stand at the margins, look under your feet, the margins are getting erased precisely because we chose to stand there. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And you stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, you get this great privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, the truth of the matter is they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other. And so the homies have taught me so much, and I'm eternally grateful to them, and it's a daily experience what they teach me. But the last few years they've taught me how to text, so I'm so grateful to them because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty dexterous at it, LOL and OMG and BTW. And the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no, which I've been using quite a bit lately. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's completely vexed by, what do you call it, autocorrect? Yeah. I had a homegirl named Bertha on a weekend on a Sunday. She said, where are you at? And I said, I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas. And monjas is Spanish for nuns, sisters. I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas. So I pushed send. And autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas, which she thought was pretty interesting. My worst one happened when a homie was asking me for some help with his rent. And I just didn't have the money. And so I wrote, things are tight, and I pushed send, and autocorrect told him, thongs are tight. And the homie wrote me back, sorry to hear that. What about my rent? You know. Anyway, but I digress. So there I am with two homies, Manuel and Poncho, and we're driving to Palm Desert, to give us a talk at a high school. Manuel's in the front seat. So we're driving when Manuel gets a incoming, a text, and he reads it to himself, and he chuckles. And I said, what is it? He goes, oh, it's stupid. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I had just seen Snoopy at our headquarters. He gave me a big abrazo as the day was beginning. And Snoopy and Manuel work in the clock-in room, which is kind of a harder job than it sounds, because this may come as a surprise to you. Gang members can occasionally be attitudinal. So it's a tough job, actually. So I said, well, what's Snoopy have to say? And he goes, oh, it's dumb. Hang on. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, the three of us, and then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all this illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? Even in your lives, every single one of you is engaged in some kind of service, and service is undoubtedly good. But service is where you begin. It can't be where you end, because service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, the place of exquisite mutuality, the place of mutual transformation, the place of connection. because there's a distance, sometimes service provider, service recipient. You want to bridge that distance. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. Truth be told, we're all in need of healing. All of us are a cry for help. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. But you want to bridge that distance and make sure there is no daylight that separates us. There was a homie, everybody called him Dreamer, and I knew him since he was a mocosito growing up in the projects, and got into a gang, a very funny kid, a very smart kid, though I don't remember school figuring in too much, and a dangerous sense of humor, which I always enjoyed with him. And he, in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. He's doing great now. But many years ago, in his early 20s, he would, I'd find a job for him. Nobody got more jobs through our organization than this guy Dreamer. And, in the private sector or in one of our 10 social enterprises. But then after a while, after a few months, he'd kind of gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So this went on quite a bit in a yo-yo kind of fashion. And though this one time he'd finished a 4-month stretch probation violation at county jail, and there he is sitting in front of me in my office. And he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." And I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I called a guy, a friend of mine who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. He had hired homies in the past. I'm thinking maybe he'll be able to do it again. And I call him with Dreamer sitting right there. And, he says, yeah, he can come in tomorrow. He can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day, and, probably 2 weeks later, he shows up in my office, and he's sitting in front of my desk, and I go, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go again." But this time he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck, and he waves it proudly, and he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, gosh, who?" And he looks at me strangely, and he says, "Well, God, of course." "Oh, sure, no, that's right, yeah. That would be God right there." And he said, "You thought I was going to say you." I said, No, gosh, God's number one, yeah. He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." And I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now," he said, Well, the two of us, we fell out of our chairs, and we just dissolved in laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. Years ago, it was one of the great privileges of my life to know Cesar Chavez, a remarkable man, one of the best listeners I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to Cesar, nobody else existed. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. But quite famously once, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual," which of course is the hope. How do we arrive at this mutuality of connection where there is no us and them, and there is no daylight that separates us? No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. For it turns out peace and justice are byproducts of our ultimate essential goal, which is to stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. So a lot of you who were forced to read my book, I'll do the Cliff Notes version. Homeboy Industries was born 1988, when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, making it, according to the LAPD, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city was my parish. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and a month ago I buried my 200th young person. Not all of them from that community, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked to do this. First thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And so they were wreaking havoc in the projects, writing on the walls, violent, selling drugs. So I walked out to them and I would corner the gang members sort of by themselves, and I'd say, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And then to my surprise, they all said, yeah. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, you know, so that kind of forced my hand a little bit. So right across the street from the church was our elementary parochial school. So the first 2 floors were the school, grades K to 8. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent, you know, where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns together in the living room and I sat them down and I said, hey, would you guys mind, you know, moving out, and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members? And they said, sure. So they did, and so that brought gang members to the church, which kind of upset the apple cart a little bit. It didn't bring them to church services, but it brought them to the church property. It was across the street. And because after all, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? You know, good people in, bad people out. So this was a good gospel challenge. And then the homies would say, you know, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the housing projects that surrounded, the factories that surrounded the projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, you know, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we invented things, you know. We had a crew to build a child care center made up of enemy gang members. We had graffiti removal crew, we had a landscaping crew. And then the unrest happened in '92, and when the whole city was exploding, our community, which was the poorest, didn't explode, and so people started to ask why, and I said, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired gang members, and so they were sort of invested. The most likely characters who might ignite the place didn't. And so a movie producer called me, summoned me, and he had $500 million. So he says, what do you want me to do with my money? And I said, buy this old abandoned bakery across the street from the church. It has ovens. We'll put hairnets on gang members, rivals, enemies baking bread together. We'll call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my entire business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we came up with the highfalutin Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved here. Not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we backed our way into now becoming the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the world on the planet Earth. About 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors trying to catch the crumb of hope that falls from the table. Most of them want to get into our 18-month training program. Keep in mind that supposedly there are 120,000 gang members in LA County with 1,100 gangs. So it's a pretty daunting reality. So once they get into the 18-month program, we have a lot of curricular things, not just for them, but for the outside community. Anger management, parenting, grief and loss, GED, we still have a school. What else do we have? Free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic with, we have 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, and we have 43 volunteer doctors, thousands and thousands of laser treatments a month. And it was all started because of a guy named Frank, who I didn't know, and he wandered into my office 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison, and he's sitting in front of my desk, and tattooed on his forehead like a damn billboard filling the entire space was, and pardon my French, it said, "Fuck the world," filled the whole space, you know. And he said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." And I said, "Well, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one, you know." And so I think, you know, where do I send him, you know, to McDonald's? You know, do you want fries with that? No, I don't want fries. Mothers running out of the store with their kids. So naturally, I hired him, and he bagged bread for 2 years. And then I went search for a doc who had a laser machine. I found one at White Memorial Hospital, and he donated 1 hour a month to chip away on Frank's forehead and a few others. And before long, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this service, so we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. And we owe it all to Frank, who, parentheses, is currently a security guard at a movie studio, and there is no trace left of the dumbest, angriest, stupidest thing he had ever done, proving, once and for all, that all of us are a whole lot more than the dumbest, angriest, worst things we've ever done. And what else do we have? So we have case management. We have a huge mental health department, in as much as we have 5 paid therapists and 47 volunteer therapists. Everybody's in therapy. We have case managers. We have a solar panel installation training program. We have all our social enterprises, Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. We have lots of restaurants. So we have the Homeboy Diner at the City Hall, the only place you can get food there. At Terminal 4, American Airlines, we have a restaurant there. A Grab and Go at Terminal 6. Farmers markets, lunch truck. We have a Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips and salsas and all the Ralphs from Ventura to San Diego. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order, and they cater. It's kind of a famous place. You know, people been showing up a lot lately. Jim Carrey, movie star, he came by. A couple months ago, with only 2 hours' notice, we got a phone call from the Secret Service that Vice President Joe Biden wanted to come by. So the motorcade, and he was taking selfies, and I wasn't there. I was making my annual 8-day silent retreat. So I got back, and there was this guy Louis Mora who was he was debriefing me. And he said, "While you were gone, we were visited by an MVP." I said, "Do you mean a VIP?" That one, VIP, yeah. Damn, do you imagine here at Homeboy Industries, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. I swear to you, this is what he said. You could never make that up anyway. So I think we're thinking of adding kind of a current affairs class, you know, kind of bring the homies up to speed, if you know what I mean. But most famously, we had Diane Keaton show up for lunch once, and she of Academy Award fame, movie star, Godfather movies, Annie Hall. And she was there with a guy who was there once a week, and so she had never been there, and her waitress is Glinda, and Glinda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, parolee, felon, been to prison, gang member. She has no clue who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, what do you recommend?" And Glinda rattles off the 3 platillos that she particularly likes, and then Diane Keaton says, "You know what? I'll have that second one. That one sounds good. And at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glinda. You know, she looks at Diane Keaton, she says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I suppose I have one of those faces, you know, that people think they've seen before. And then Glinda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Oh, my God, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly, kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And if you'll permit me to say what I think is on God's mind, you might listen to Jesus, who kind of says to the gathered, that you may be one. I suppose he could have said more about himself, but it's really about us. It's about kinship and connection and mutual transformation. All of us are called to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy Industries, we don't really believe in holding the bar up and asking anybody to measure up. What we really believe in is holding the mirror up and telling people the truth, knowing that my truth is your truth, and your truth is a gang member's truth, and it all happens to be the same truth. And here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. But when you watch folks on the margins believe that truth, they become that truth. They inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's so huge. But occasionally you have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from their truth. I would invite you sometime to take a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles. You know, you could read it, I suppose, as a snapshot, quaint snapshot, of life in the earliest Christian community, or you can actually read it as the measure of health in any community at all, including in this one. Things will leap off the page if you read it that way. Things like, see how they love one another. It doesn't get better. There's nobody needy in this community, it says. That's a great metric. But my favorite one is an odd one. It says simply this, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of health of any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Some years ago, I was invited to speak at Richmond, Virginia, to 600 social workers, and I get these invitations, and I'll say, sure, you know, and then I don't really study it that carefully, you know, and so months will pass or weeks will pass, and I'll pull out the letter. What is this thing in Richmond, Virginia? So I read it, and it turns out it's a one-day conference. And I figure I'm keynote, beginning and middle, something. It's a one-day conference. It's a gang in-service from 9 to 5. I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5. So I immediately called 2 homies in, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down. And I said, look, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. So I'd never heard their stories before, and Jose gets up, he's like 25 at the time, and he was in our 18-month training program, gang member, felon, been to prison, tattooed, on parole. But he worked his way through our the 18 months, different things, clerical, janitorial, he ended up as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he was helping younger folks with their addiction issues. A man who had spent a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up and he kind of begins in a self-effacing way. He says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he said, it sounds way worser in Spanish, he said to them, and everybody laughed. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. He said, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door. And this man comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see the blood. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could speak again, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. Because if we do not welcome our own wounds, we will have a tendency to despise the wounded. Nobody in this amphitheater or beyond it has ever met a healthy treatment plan that was born from a bad diagnosis. I don't think that's ever happened. I have to ask a doctor, but I don't believe I don't think it can happen. A bad diagnosis can't ever get you to a good treatment plan. And part of the problem is we've always diagnosed this poorly. Years ago I had leukemia, and I still go in every once in a while to get treatments occasionally. Or as the homies still say, I hear your cancer's in intermission. I said, yes, apparently it's stepped out to the lobby to buy popcorn. May the line be long. But at first I went to go give blood. I always gave blood all the time because my dad used to give blood, and he and I always had the blood that everybody can take or whatever it is. And the guy sort of blanched. He said, you got to get to a doctor. So I went to a doctor, and he said I had mono. And so treated me for that or didn't treat me for that. Anyway, I think we can agree there's a difference between mononucleosis and leukemia. But my point is, a bad diagnosis is not neutral. It puts you behind the 8 ball. You lose time. I had to be rushed into chemo because they had diagnosed it wrong. But we're always diagnosing this wrong. So there I am on the Dr. Phil show. I know, what was I thinking, but we thought we had talked the producers down from doing something really dumb. And so there I am backstage, and I can hear Dr. Phil. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, Father Greg Boyle. So I walk out there, and they have bleachers. I know none of you have ever seen the show before, but they have bleachers, and the audience is clapping. Well, I see Phil sitting in the middle of the stage, sitting on a stool. My empty stool is next to him, awaiting my arrival. But on his side of the stage is a beautiful, gorgeous mahogany coffin on one of those little gurney deals with the drapes around it and the four wheels. On my side of the stage is a perfectly reconstructed jail cell. Bars, bed, sink, toilet. They went to great expense for these two set pieces. Well, you already know where this is going to go. They fly out, 3 young males, 14, 15, 16, African-American, Latino, and a Caucasian kid with their very distraught single mothers. These are all 3 kids who seem to be walking perilously close to some kind of gang involvement. And so one at a time they bring them out, and Phil sort of grabs them figuratively by the lapel and says, "Don't you see where this choice is leading you?" Death or prison. Finally, by the 3rd kid, I couldn't take it anymore, and I said, "Phil, how do I break this to you? These kids don't need more information. They are not awaiting more data. They know this will lead to death or to prison. They don't care that it will." And that's the key diagnostic moment. Nobody in this amphitheater or beyond it has ever met a hopeful kid who joined a gang. That's never happened in the history of kids. That's never happened in the history of gangs. Hopeful kids don't. Gangs are the places kids go when they've encountered their life as misery, and who doesn't know by now that misery loves company? No kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something. No exceptions. Gang violence is the urban poor's version of teenage suicide. It is about a lethal absence of hope. The 3 profiles of kids who join gangs are simple and clear. There aren't 5, there aren't 8, there are only 3. There's the kid who's despondent and can't imagine tomorrow. And if you cannot imagine your tomorrow, then your present isn't compelling for you. And if your present doesn't compel you, then you will not care whether you inflict harm, and you won't care whether you duck to get out of harm's way. The second profile of a kid who joins a gang is a traumatized, damaged kid. And this kid cannot see his way clear to transform his pain, so he keeps transmitting it. And the third profile of a kid who joins a gang is a mentally ill kid. Now, these 3 profiles appear on some continuum with a varying range of severity. More despondent than mentally ill, more traumatized than despondent. But if we knew that that was the correct diagnosis, and I would bet my life on it, then we would infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign. And we would help heal the damaged and traumatized kid. And we would deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way. I'm going to end with a story, and then I think I will open it up for and I promise at exactly 8, we will stop. Okay. So I'll anticipate a question. It's about enemies working together, and it's kind of tough at first, Homies will come in. Our program is not for those who need help. It's only for those who want it. And so you have to walk in the front door. And they'll come in, they'll say, "I'm ready, ready, ready." And in the old days anyway, I used to say, "Well, we have an opening in the bakery, but you have to work with X, Y, and Z." And I rattle off the names of enemies, rivals. And they always do the same thing. They think for a long time, and then they go, "Okay, I'll work with them. I'm not going to talk to them." And I remember how much that bothered me in the early days, until you discover, of course, that you cannot demonize somebody you know, that human beings can't pull that off. So I had a homie everybody called Youngster, a little chaparrito, about 19 years old, thought he was ready. I bring him to Homeboy Silkscreen, which has been around for 21 years. Huge, thousands and thousands of gang members have worked there over the years. 2,500 customers from all over the country, high quality work, reasonably priced. We UPS to Whittier. So I bring Youngster in there to introduce him to his 30 coworkers, and I watch this little chaparrito as he shakes hands with everybody, including, enemies, a lot of rivals. Firm handshake, looking them in the eye, And I think, wow, this is great. Until he gets to the last guy, a guy who seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether, a guy everybody called Puppet. And when Puppet and Youngster are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something, they stare at their shoes, they don't shake hands. Well, I know they're enemies because I know what gangs they hail from, but he just finished shaking hands with a whole bunch of enemies. So I sensed that much at the moment, that something was not right. I found out later that this was a deeply personal hatred beyond which neither of them thought they could get past. So I was kind of sensing that. So I said, look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know. I got a bunch of people who want this job. Calladitos, they don't say a word. Well, 6 months later, Puppet leaves his home and goes to a corner store some distance from his house, and he purchases something. And on the way home, for some reason, he decides to take a shortcut, and so he dodges into an alley, and because he took this detour, suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1, and they beat him badly. And while he falls to the ground, and while he's lying there, these guys will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead. At the hospital, they keep him connected to machines for 48 hours so that you can get 2 full days of a flat read with no brain activity, and then the doctors can sign the death certificate, making it official. This allowed family and friends to gather. I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life. Nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. And so at the end of the 48 hours, as a priest, I said a blessing over him. I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected. And a week later, we buried him. But in the first 24 hours, as a Puppet was lying beaten in the hospital, I'm alone in my office. It's 8:30 at night, and the phone rings, and it's Youngster, Puppet's co-worker from the silkscreen factory. Hey, he says, that's messed up about what happened to Puppet. I said, yeah, it is. And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, is there anything I could do? Can I give him my blood? And we both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence, choking back his tears, and he says with great deliberation, he was not my enemy. He was my friend. We worked together. Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy? Well, of course it does. Any exceptions? No. I can't think of a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us, that we be one, just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out it's mutual. And so you're educating yourselves for a purpose, and the purpose is to stand at the margins. And you find your way out there, and you look under your feet, and you notice that the margins are getting erased because you chose to stand there. And then you brace yourself, because who's not going to accuse you of wasting your time? But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you go from here and you make those voices heard. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it. Thank you very much.